Hey guys, tonight we're heading somewhere humid, green and ancient, soaked in silence, except for the hiss of insects and the slow creak of trees. Imagine standing barefoot on damp jungle soil. Vines stretch like lazy snakes across crumbling stone. A bird calls out somewhere above, and in front of you, half swallowed by roots, a carving so detailed, so deliberate, they feel alive. And somehow, even in all this decay, you can feel it. The trace of something enormous, a lost world, a forgotten power. Welcome to the Khmer Empire. You probably won't survive this, by the way, not because of the leeches or the heat or the fact that some of these temples are still guarded by monkeys with serious attitude, but because this story spans centuries, dynasties, and a kind of ambition that makes modern skyscrapers look like Lego sets. And while you're at it, post your location and local time in the comments. It's always nice knowing who else is time traveling with us tonight. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture Southeast Asia over 1,000 years ago. No phones, no maps, just heat, water, and forest. At the heart of this thick green world, before there was any Angkor or empire, there were rivers, and along those rivers, people who knew how to listen. They listened to the sky, to the spirits, to the water. They knew when to plant, when to harvest, when to flee the rising flood. These early societies, small, scattered communities across what's now Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam, weren't empires, not yet, but they were watching, building, and dreaming. By the 1st century CE, a kingdom called Fonan had already formed near the Mekong Delta. It's often considered the first major Southeast Asian state, but historians still argue whether it was even a kingdom at all. Was it a federation of city-states? A loose trade network, a glorified rice farm with a really good PR guy? We don't know for sure, but what's clear is that Fonan started absorbing ideas from India, writing, architecture, astrology, and especially religion. From there, the seed took root. As Funan declined, another power, Chenla, rose from the north, and eventually, out of all that shifting soil, came a people who started calling themselves Khmer. They weren't building empires yet, but they were building identities, culture, rice paddies, and slowly, quietly, foundations. Now here's the thing about early Khmer culture. It didn't just borrow from India, it remixed it. Instead of adopting Indian gods directly, they transformed them. Local spirits, ancestor worship, and jungle animism wrapped themselves around these new ideas like banyan roots over stone. They also adored a strange little thing called the linga, a smooth, upright stone pillar that represented Shiva's divine power. And yes, it's exactly what you're thinking, phallic. But to the Khmer, it was no joke. It wasn't dirty or even funny. It was the cosmic source of creation, both spiritual and political. Plant one of these babies in your temple, and you weren't just praying. You were claiming divine right to rule. Imagine a mountain as sacred as heaven. That's Mount Meru, a Hindu concept of the cosmic axis, where gods live, and all creation spins around it. Khmer kings were obsessed with this. It wasn't just metaphor, they tried to build it. In stone, even if you hated your taxes, you didn't say a word, because that sweaty man on the gilded throne wasn't your boss. He was the universe made flesh, and you can bet kings loved that. Which brings us to the idea of the god king, or Devaraja, literally, the god who is king. This was a concept so powerful, so all-consuming, it became the spine of Khmer political theology. The king wasn't just chosen by the gods, he was a god, embodied, present, living among you, eating your rice, riding your elephants. It sounds absurd now, but for centuries it was the truth, carved into stone. Still, this was all early groundwork. The grand temples hadn't risen yet. The vast water systems, the sprawling cities, the epic wars, they were still in the future. Right now, the Khmer world was a series of test runs. Kings rose, kings fell. One city might be sacred for a decade, then abandoned to termites and time. It's like trying to rebuild a novel from 3 surviving letters and some coffee stains. The problem is, The jungle doesn't preserve memories kindly. The early cities built mostly from wood vanished into rot and undergrowth. What little remains is stone, a few crumbling towers, some silent lingers, inscriptions worn smooth by centuries of rain. He wanted to turn this scattered, steaming world into something permanent. But not just any Jayavarman. This one had ambition in his bones. He didn't want to be just another regional boss with a nice hat and a handful of monks. He wanted something larger, older, eternal. Even so, we know something was stirring. By the 8th century, regional lords were fighting for dominance. The temples got bigger, the rituals more theatrical, and somewhere in that chaotic swirl of kingship and conquest, a man named Jayavarman stepped forward. For now, listen to the jungle. Underneath the chirps and croaks, you can almost hear it. But that's for next time. Stone grinding, chisels tapping. So here we are, standing under a jungle canopy, and there's a smooth stone rising out of the earth in front of you. It's been shaped, polished, and set inside a perfectly square temple chamber. It catches a little shaft of sunlight, and it looks, well, let's be honest, it looks like a giant stone phallus. And yes, that's exactly what it is. The Empire breathing in. But this isn't some ancient prank. This is serious business. What you're looking at is a linga, the sacred pillar of Shiva. And in the Khmer Empire, it was more than just a religious symbol. It was the centerpiece of royal power, the spiritual antenna connecting the king to the heavens. If you had a linga in your state temple, you weren't just a ruler, you were a god on earth. Now, let's rewind a little. You've probably heard of Shiva, the Hindu god who destroys and recreates the universe. The Khmer embraced Shiva early on, not just as a deity to be worshipped, but as a force to be embodied. And the linga, it wasn't just symbolic, it was Shiva, his presence, his essence, his, well, cosmic potency. And it didn't stop there. Each king had his own personal linga, representing his soul, his divine authority, and his link to the gods. This sacred stone was installed in the empire's holiest temples, often on top of man-made mountains, designed to represent Mount Meru, the spiritual center of the universe. So yeah, it wasn't subtle. The whole setup screamed, I am the world. And here's where things get a little awkward for modern brains. Because this fusion of politics, religion, and sexuality wasn't just symbolic, it was lived. Some temples were explicitly designed to host fertility rituals. Others reenacted the cosmic union of Shiva and his consort through dance, incense, and offerings. You might even find yourself at a royal ceremony watching sacred dancers perform movements meant to mirror celestial lovemaking, while everyone sat very seriously pretending this was entirely holy and not at all weird. No pressure. But here's the thing, this wasn't just some wild power trip. The Khmer believed deeply in cosmic balance. The king wasn't there to rule like a tyrant. He was supposed to uphold harmony between heaven and earth. So if the rains didn't come, or the harvest failed, or people started dying of fevers in the lowlands, it meant something had gone wrong with that balance. Maybe the king's linga wasn't being properly worshipped. Maybe the rituals had failed. Or maybe, just maybe, it was time for a new king with a shinier linga. And sometimes, they acted. Of course, being a god king had its downsides. You didn't really get to have a bad day. You couldn't say, hey, sorry I missed that solar eclipse ritual. I had a migraine. Nope, you were the ritual. And if things in the empire started going sideways, people looked at your holy stone and asked questions you probably didn't want to answer. But it was holy. That's the thing. The line between sacred and strange didn't exist here. Kings weren't just governing, they were embodying cosmic truth. They weren't acting like gods, they were becoming gods. Through temple construction, through ceremony, through devotion, through stone. Now, let's talk about the logistics of all this. You didn't just build a temple overnight. The sandstone had to be quarried, often miles away, and floated downriver on rafts. Massive stone blocks were dragged through jungle mud by oxen and men, carved with obsessive detail, and fitted together with almost no mortar. Whole armies of artisans worked on a single temple, chiseling divine scenes into every available inch of wall, ceiling, and column. And at the center of it all, the linga, sometimes placed inside a shrine so sacred only a handful of priests could enter. Other times hoisted high into the tallest tower, looming above the empire like a spiritual radio beacon. From here, the king's divine presence pulsed outward into the rivers, the fields, the villages. But even in this system of sacred certainty, there were cracks. Kings died, sons fought, warlords rebelled. Sometimes the wrong man took the throne, or the right man took it the wrong way. And behind all that polished stone was a question nobody wanted to ask too loudly. Historians still argue whether the Linga cult was truly about power, or whether it was simply the most efficient spiritual propaganda ever invented. Some scholars suggest that these rituals helped unify a scattered empire, giving everyone from rice farmers to palace scribes a shared belief system. Others think it was a clever way for kings to keep priests close and rivals nervous. What if the king isn't divine at all? What if he's just a guy with a rock? Either way, it worked. The Khmer didn't just build temples, they were the temples. Living systems of belief, politics, and architecture. And the Linga, this oddly shaped stone pillar, was the heartbeat of it all. Quirky side note, some Lingas were even decorated with little golden crowns or surrounded by rings of sacred water. Others were hidden away during invasions, buried deep so the gods couldn't be captured, and at least one temple had its Linga replaced with a rival king's version, like changing out a presidential portrait, but significantly more magical and weirdly suggestive. So next time you see one of those silent stone towers in the jungle, remember what's probably sitting inside it. Not just a religious artifact, not just a symbol, but the beating heart of an empire. But don't blame me if it whispers back. And if you're feeling bold, touch it, just a little. The story of the Khmer Empire doesn't really begin until Jayavarman II walks onto the stage. And by walks, I mean he probably rode in on an elephant, wearing gold, with priests chanting and warriors marching behind him. You don't show up to declare yourself a god without a bit of drama. Now, we don't know exactly where Jayavarman came from. Some say he was born in the south. Others think he was raised in Java, across the sea, where Indianized courts were already playing with big ideas. Hindu epics, warrior kings, divine thrones. Wherever he started, by the year 802 CE, Jayavarman had returned to the Khmer homeland with a bold idea: the gods are real. I speak for them, and I'm going to unify this whole mess. Jayavarman II did something no one else had dared. On a sacred mountain called Phunam Kulan, he held a ceremony unlike any other. He called in Brahmin priests, think religious specialists with serious sway, and declared himself the Devaraja, the god king, the living embodiment of Shiva on earth, not a follower, not a servant. The actual divine presence in royal form. It was a mess. The region was a patchwork of warring city-states, each with its own little king, its own holy mountain, and its own ambition. For centuries, no one had managed to pull it all together. Until now. This wasn't just royal flair. This was the creation of a new order, a spiritual framework that would hold the Khmer Empire together for centuries. By tying kingship directly to the divine, Jayavarman wasn't just centralizing power, he was making it untouchable. You don't rebel against the king if the king is literally God. Unless you really want to see what smiting feels like. Imagine standing there, jungle mist curling around your ankles, drums echoing through the trees, priest chanting in Sanskrit, and then this man, this bold, terrifying man says, "This world is mine, because I am the world." And somehow, it sticks. But let's not pretend everyone clapped politely and bowed. Jayavarman had to take power first. There were battles, alliances, quiet assassinations, loud ones too, and somewhere in the shadows, other lords were watching closely, waiting to see if this god-king thing would last more than a season. He chose a new capital, Mahendraparvata, high in the Kulin hills, where his temple rose like a spine of stone, crowned with a linga, taller than you'd want to carry, without divine assistance. This was the heart of the newly declared Khmer Empire, and from here he began to spread his influence, like a tide creeping downriver. Spoiler, it did. He also started standardizing rituals, temple structures, and royal ideology. Suddenly, everything had to match. The same sacred architecture, the same king-centered religion, the same language, carved into every stone. Sanskrit, it wasn't the local tongue, but it sounded powerful, and that was the point. But Jayavarman wasn't just conquering with swords. He understood the quiet power of symbols. When he installed his personal linga, he wasn't just worshipping Shiva, he was anchoring himself as the center of the universe. The cosmic mountain, that was his temple, the axis of the heavens right there, in his throne room. Every sunrise, every harvest, every prayer, it all flowed through him. And yes, historians still argue whether Jayavarman was a true visionary or just really, really good at branding. We don't have many inscriptions from Jayavarman's reign. Stone doesn't gossip easily, but what we do have suggests he ruled for decades, surviving enemies, uprisings, and maybe even the weather. He laid roads, built temples, and turned a dozen little kingdoms into a single body. Because if you believe you're a god, your territory isn't just land, it's you. Every grain of rice, every river bend, every sunrise, all of it radiating from your divine essence. It's not narcissism if the priests are backing you up with sacred geometry and incense. His body. Now here's something wonderfully weird. At least one inscription claims Jayavarman dissolved the influence of Java. That's not subtle. If he really was raised there, he wasn't exactly sending thank you cards when he came back. Instead, he wiped away foreign ties and rebuilt the empire in his image. Khmer, independent, eternal, but the world he made was fragile. All systems are. A few decades after his death, the capital moved. New kings rose. His temples began to fade under moss. Yet the idea of Devaraya, the god king, stuck around. Deeply, permanently. Like a nail hammered into the spine of Khmer civilization. And for centuries afterward, every new king would reenact what Jayavarman had done. He'd hold the rituals, plant the linga, build the temples, call himself the world. Still, for better or worse, Jayavarman had done what no one else could. He'd taken scattered tribes and turned them into an empire, not through bureaucracy, not even through war, but through belief. And while all that divine pomp sounds glorious, don't forget someone had to haul those stones. Someone had to grow the rice to feed the priests. Someone had to carry messages through the jungle, barefoot and bug-bitten, for a god who never even learned their name. Even long after Jayavarman's name slipped into legend, his blueprint held. His voice might be silent, but his architecture remained, both in stone and in the way kings saw themselves. And belief, once carved in stone, is hard to erase. You can't build an empire in a jungle without figuring out how to beat the jungle first. And the Khmer did that, not with fire or brute force, but with geometry, stone, and patience. They didn't just tame the land, they engineered it. Because here's the thing, rain in Cambodia doesn't come gently. It comes in one long, unpredictable dump each year, and then disappears. So you either learn how to trap it, or you get swallowed by drought. If Jayavarman II gave the Khmer Empire its soul, then water gave it its body. Think of it like a jungle-wide plumbing system, with divine implications. Enter the bare. Bares were giant man-made reservoirs, massive rectangles of water, dug by hand and lined with precision-cut blocks. Some of these things were over 5 kilometers long. That's not just a pond, that's an inland sea. And it wasn't just about having a backup drinking source. No, this was full-blown water management. These berets were designed to capture monsoon rains, hold them through the dry season, and release water into irrigation channels at exactly the right time. Now here's where things get wild. Some scholars think the Khmer might have understood hydraulic pressure well enough to build self-regulating water systems. That's right, valves, gradients, overflow zones. They were basically doing environmental engineering centuries before the modern world figured out storm drains. And failure wasn't an option. The Khmer believed that controlling water meant controlling cosmic balance. If the king really was the living axis of the world, then keeping rice fields lush and rivers tame was part of his divine duty. When the canals overflowed or the bares cracked, it wasn't just a maintenance problem, it was a spiritual failure. There's one bare in particular you should remember, the East Bare, or Yasha Darata Turka. Built in the 10th century, it could hold something like 50 million cubic meters of water. That's more than enough to irrigate 100,000 acres of rice paddies, or to make a serious impression on visiting dignitaries. Imagine arriving by boat, floating across a man-made lake as golden-roofed temples rise out of the mist. You'd believe in god kings too. And if that isn't extra, I don't know what is. But as always, the line between science and spirituality was blurry. The Baris weren't just practical, they were sacred. Each reservoir mirrored the mythical ocean of milk from Hindu cosmology. Remember Mount Meru, the divine mountain at the center of the universe? The Baris were the seas around it. So when you looked out from the temple's central tower and saw that massive pool glinting in the sunlight, you weren't just admiring the landscaping, you were staring into the structure of the cosmos. But none of this came easy. Digging Baris meant thousands of workers toiling in thick mud under monsoon skies, with mosquitoes the size of house cats. It meant cutting down forests, carving channels, and laying bricks under spiritual pressure. Because if that reservoir failed, if the canals cracked, if the crops died, it wouldn't be the engineers who took the blame, it'd be the king. Quirky side note, one of the oldest Khmer texts we've found is basically a water inspection report. That's right. Among all the poetry and cosmic philosophy, some poor guy had to write, Reservoir 4B isn't holding up, needs repairs before the dry season. Bureaucracy, it seems, is eternal. Of course, nobody ruled alone. The Khmer had an entire class of engineers, priests, and bureaucrats, making sure water flowed where it was supposed to. Priests read omens, astronomers tracked monsoons, and surveyors measured gradients with tools we still don't fully understand. They even carved maps onto temple walls, stone blueprints of an empire literally drawn with rivers. But the system worked, with barrays feeding into canals, and canals feeding into fields. The Khmer turned one harvest into 2 or even 3 per year. That's unheard of for the time. Most societies could barely feed themselves. The Khmer were producing surplus grain that could be taxed, stored, traded, or turned into temple labor. The empire's population swelled, cities grew, temples multiplied, and through it all, water flowed quietly beneath the surface, like the veins of a living body. It connected everything, rice farmer to king, shrine to capital, earth to sky. Because when you feed a kingdom, you build a kingdom. And historians still argue whether this water system was purely utilitarian, or part of a broader ritual landscape. Some believe every barre, every canal, every floodplain was part of a sacred geometry, designed not just for farming, but to mirror the universe itself. A kingdom shaped like a mandala. Either way, it was brilliant. And it worked. Until it didn't. But that's a story for later. It wasn't just irrigation, it was divinity in motion. For now, just imagine the scene. A kingdom glowing under moonlight, berets shimmering like mirrors, canals reflecting temple towers, water whispering through carved stone channels. So far, you've heard about temples and kings, sacred stones and cosmic plumbing. But none of that prepared the world for what came next. Because now, finally, Angkor rises. Imagine waking up in the 9th or 10th century and stepping outside your bamboo hut, only to find that the jungle has started growing buildings. Massive, golden, silent buildings. Towers like mountain peaks, walls covered in gods and monsters, carved so deeply the stories ripple when the light hits. Entire cities, where stone replaces tree and the divine seems to walk beside you. This wasn't just a capital. Angkor was a statement, a flex, a love letter to the gods, written in rice, water, and architecture. But don't think of Angkor as a single city with one downtown. Think of it like a network, a living, breathing ecosystem of temples, homes, roads, reservoirs, and rice fields. Some people lived in palaces. Most lived in wooden houses, raised on stilts to avoid floods and snakes. You wouldn't see many walls or gates. This wasn't a fortress, it was an open city designed to be eternal, not easily defended, and from there, it snowballed. Successive kings kept adding to the dream. Every new ruler had to outdo the last one. More towers, more temples, bigger barres, better moats. Soon the city sprawled across more than 400 square kilometers, a size that dwarfed even some modern cities. It starts with Yasovarman Dorith, a king obsessed with vision. He moved the capital to a flatter area near the Sim Rape River and started building on a scale that hadn't been tried before. his masterpiece. Phnom Penh, a stepped pyramid temple built right on a hill, meant to represent Mount Meru, naturally, because it's not a real empire until you've built the entire universe out of sandstone. That openness is part of what made it feel holy. Angkor wasn't just a political capital, it was a cosmic model, a sacred map of the universe made real. Every temple aligned with stars, every bar reflected mythology. You didn't live in Angkor, you existed in it, like a gear in some divine machine. The crown jewel, of course, was Angkor Wat, but we're not there yet. That came later. First came a whole cast of kings, each laying stones like prayers. Rajendravarman, Suryavarman, 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 Seth, Udayadityavarman II. Names like thunder that echo across the centuries. These weren't kings who merely sat on thrones. They ruled with spades, with chisels, with sacred rituals that could last all night. They weren't building cities, they were building belief. And oh, the details. Imagine walking through a temple corridor, and every inch of stone is alive. Dancers, warriors, gods, demons. No blank space. The Khmer didn't just build walls, they told stories, thousands of them, epics from the Ramayana and Mahabharata, twisted into uniquely Khmer forms, featuring local costumes, weapons and attitudes. It's like fan fiction, but if fan fiction was 800 feet long and took 50 years to carve. Quirky side note, hidden in some corners of these carvings are real-life events. Battles, rituals, even festivals. One temple even includes a scene of a king getting high on betel nut while elephants dance in the background. Okay, that might be a generous interpretation, but something weird is happening in that scene. And while the stone parts are all we see today, the real Angkor, the one that buzzed with life, was made of wood. Homes, markets, music halls, even the royal palace. Wood doesn't survive jungle humidity, so all of that vanished, swallowed by termites and time. What we're left with is the skeleton, the sacred parts, the frame. But for a few glittering centuries, that wooden world pulsed with energy. Picture a boatman poling down a canal, passing monks in saffron robes, kids playing near rice fields, dancers practicing under banana trees, all of it held together by roads so precise, they ran straight as arrows for miles. Because Angkor wasn't just built up, it was built out. Roads stretched to every corner of the empire, paved, shaded by trees, and spaced with rest houses for travelers. Imagine that, ancient Khmer service stations. With the result, an empire that felt connected, unified, massive. Historians still argue whether Angkor was really a city by modern standards, or something more like a ritual center with suburbs. But one thing is clear, no other place in the ancient world looked or worked quite like this. And yet, for all its grandeur, Angkor had no single center, no main plaza, no clear downtown, just a rolling sea of temples and paddies, rituals and roads. You could walk for hours and still feel like you hadn't seen the whole thing. Some estimates say nearly 1 million people lived in and around Angkor at its peak. That's almost unthinkable for a pre-industrial society, but they managed it. With rice, with water, with stone. It was beautiful, but also vulnerable, but not yet, not here, right now. Angkor is thriving. The baris are full, the gods are pleased. The temples shine with gold leaf and incense smoke. And somewhere, a king stands at the top of his cosmic tower, watching the sun rise over his empire. Because the same openness that made it feel divine, made it fragile. He believes it will last forever. Let's keep walking. And for a while, it almost does. The stone under your feet is warm from the sun. It's not just any path, it's part of a raised road, perfectly straight, flanked by moats and lined with trees planted centuries ago. These aren't trails made by accident. They're engineered, and they stretch from the heart of Angkor to the furthest reaches of the kingdom. This is how an empire moves. Not through legend or whispers, but through roads. You see, once the temples were up and the reservoirs filled, the Khmer needed a way to hold all that territory together. The jungle isn't just hard to cross, it's downright moody. Rivers shift, trees swallow paths in months. So the Khmer said, let's pave over nature, and they actually did. They built a network of highways, more than 1,000 kilometers long, slicing through mountains, forests, and floodplains, like a system of stone veins. Temples weren't just places to pray, they were control points. Political, religious, economic. If Angkor was the brain, temples were the nerve endings, keeping the kingdom's muscles from going limp. A new temple meant the king had reached there. It was like planting a flag, but with a lot more incense and cosmic alignment. And at the end of every road, a temple. And they were everywhere. Big ones, small ones, half-hidden jungle shrines and towering city temples with moats and causeways. You could be a rice farmer in the middle of nowhere and still see a temple tower poking out of the tree line, like the edge of heaven. Some were carved so finely you'd swear the gods had delicate fingers. Others were heavy, blocky, more fortress than church. But they all pointed upward, as if the Khmer needed their buildings to reach the gods before their prayers did. These weren't just built to last, they were built to impress. One standout from this era is Preah Khan, a temple monastery built by Jayavarman VII, which we'll talk more about soon. It had libraries, shrines, even schools, and it sat right along one of those great roads, like a spiritual service station. If you were a monk walking from Angkor to the far provinces, you'd stop at places like this. Eat, pray, maybe fix your sandals. But temples weren't just for holy men. They were where tax records were kept, where local governors held court, where scribes inked royal decrees onto palm leaves, while monkeys chatted in the rafters. Temples were the interface between the state and the people, a place where the king's face, carved 1,000 times into the stone, reminded you who ruled your land, your rice, your soul. A traveling monk could walk from Angkor to the Vietnamese coast without once having to camp in the mud. That's not just infrastructure, that's imperial vision. And then there were the rest houses, about every 15 kilometers along the roads. Think medieval Khmer pit stops, except instead of gas and coffee you got food, water, a place to sleep, and probably a sermon. These weren't luxury hotels, they were humble shelters paid for by the crown, open to pilgrims, traders, soldiers, messengers. And that's where the armies come in. But what's a road without something to march on it? The roads themselves, built with sand and stone, sometimes raised above flood levels, sometimes flanked with embankments. Their dead straightness is still visible from satellites, which is both impressive and just a little spooky. Khmer military might isn't as famous as its temples, but it was very real. Armies moved fast, thanks to those roads. They traveled with elephants, chariots, and troops trained not just in combat, but in ritual warfare. That's right. Some battles were preceded by spiritual contests, blessings or duels meant to tip the karmic scales. And yes, they rode elephants, not just for intimidation, but for real battlefield strategy. Imagine a dozen armored elephants thundering down one of those stone-paved roads. Your armies lined up across a muddy field, and here comes a living wall of tusks and fury. You either run, or you get flattened into history. The Khmer didn't conquer for fun. They fought to secure borders, punish rebellion, or liberate holy sites. Though of course that word always depends on who's writing the inscription. And here's a curious twist. Some temples were actually built from the spoils of war, stones dragged from captured cities, treasure repurposed as sacred offerings, even prisoners put to work as laborers. One temple's inscription brags about the king bringing back gifts from a foreign kingdom, which, loosely translated, probably means we looted them politely. Historians still debate whether these military campaigns were well organized or just glorified raiding. Some say the Khmer had a standing army, others believe they mobilized peasants only during crisis. The records are vague, poetic, and often, let's be honest, exaggerated. But one thing is certain, those roads weren't just built for monks and rice traders. They were arteries of control, and the temples they led to, not just places of worship, but outposts of power. Imagine the empire now. Picture it from above. Great stone highways, stretching like roots across a dark green sea. Moats glinting, towers rising. The slow, deliberate movement of elephants, ox carts, pilgrims, priests. A kingdom bound not by borders, but by belief and stone. All of it pointing back to Angkor, the cosmic center, where the God King sits in his high tower, watching the lines tighten. Let's step off the dusty road for a moment and slip behind the palace walls into the heart of the Khmer court. It's cooler here, quiet, but not silent. You can hear faint music, twinkling chimes, the soft thump of drums, and the rustle of silk. Lanterns flicker, jasmine hangs in the air, and someone, several someones, is dancing. And Sara dancing wasn't entertainment, it was ritual. Each movement represented something, a season, a prayer, a story from the heavens. And they didn't just perform in temples, they performed for the king himself. Sometimes as part of royal ceremonies, sometimes simply to maintain cosmic order. Because in this world, everything had divine purpose, even an elbow bend. These are the Apsaras, celestial dancers draped in gold, crowned with towering headdresses, their fingers bending in delicate, impossible gestures. In Khmer mythology, Apsaras were born of the gods, but here in Angkor, they're born in the palace, trained from childhood to perform dances so precise, so otherworldly, they were considered more sacred than speech. And make no mistake, the king wasn't just a viewer, he was the center of this choreography. The divine access, every bow, every chant, every twirl of an Apsara's hand was directed toward him. Not as a man, but as a god. So let's talk about the court, because it wasn't just gold and incense, it was theater, drama, an endless parade of hierarchy and ritual, where power wasn't shouted, it was whispered, veiled behind fans, staged on carpets, weighed in the tilt of a head or the choice of a lotus flower. The palace itself, though made mostly of wood, was vast, probably sprawling with courtyards, shaded galleries, pools, kitchens, treasuries, and ceremonial halls. Almost nothing survives today, but the stone reliefs tell us enough. Servants with parasols, nobles on cushions, dancers mid-step, scribes bent over palm leaves, and always, the king in the middle, motionless, watching. You didn't just waltz into the throne room. Getting near the king required layers of ceremony. You were expected to bow so low your forehead touched the floor, and no sudden movements, please. The king was considered the living center of the universe. A wrong glance could be seen as an insult to the gods themselves. Even his clothes were sacred. Gold-threaded robes, fragrant oils, jewelry so heavy you could hear him coming. He didn't dress for style, he dressed to radiate, to remind everyone in the room who held the divine spark. But he didn't act alone. Surrounding him was an army of advisors, priests, generals, and specialists. Some had real influence, others just made it look good. One inscription even lists over 1,000 dancers attached to a single temple. That's not a performance, that's an entire department of sacred HR. And here's something fun. The Khmer were also big on omens, stars, birds, dreams. Everything was interpreted. Before big events, court astrologers might delay a decision for days, waiting for the right alignment. Historians still argue whether this slowed governance, or simply gave everyone more time to prepare their outfits. But not everything was serenity and incense. Feasts and ceremonies could turn into quiet power moves. An offered flower might be a symbol of loyalty, or a veiled insult. One general's absence from a royal dance wasn't just rude, it was possibly treason. And behind those gentle smiles of the court dancers, you can bet there were ears listening, eyes watching. Quirky detail. One temple carving shows a royal cat, not a tiger, an actual pampered house cat, sitting on a cushion, possibly more relaxed than anyone else in the room, which tells you everything you need to know about palace hierarchy. The court was also a nest of politics. Royal succession wasn't always neat. Kings had multiple wives, concubines, siblings, and children, some legitimate, some mysteriously adopted. When one king died, you didn't get a clean transfer of power. You got theater, and sometimes violence. And all of this, the dances, the rituals, the drama, fed back into the empire itself. Because when people in the provinces heard that the God King had performed the seasonal blessing with 62 dancers and 3 white elephants, They didn't just think, wow, that sounds expensive. They thought, all is in balance. The gods are pleased. My rice will grow. And here's the real magic. It worked. That was the point. The palace wasn't just ruling. It was performing stability, embodying divine rhythm. For a while, at least. Because as long as the dancers twirled and the ceremonies flowed, and the king sat shining at the center, Angkor held together. Through floods, droughts, even small rebellions, the rituals glued the empire. But behind the gold curtains, pressure was building. A new king was waiting in the wings. A man who would take all of this beauty, all of this belief, and try to turn it into something even more immense. And Jayavarman VII, he wasn't coming to dance. Because grief can do strange things to a god. We don't hear much about him for decades. He doesn't show up in the inscriptions, he doesn't lead ceremonies, and he isn't in the line of succession, not officially anyway. But somewhere in the background, he's waiting, watching, mourning. And when the time finally comes, he doesn't just step into the spotlight. The story of Jayavarman VII begins, strangely enough, in silence. He was coming to remake the empire. He rebuilds the stage. By the late 12th century, the Khmer Empire was shaken. Angkor had been invaded by the Chams, seaborne enemies from what is now central Vietnam. They didn't just poke the borders, they stormed all the way to the heart of Angkor and sacked the capital. Imagine that a kingdom that had stood like stone for centuries, suddenly on fire, priests scattered, towers desecrated, dancers silenced, and out of that chaos came Jayavarman VII. No one knows exactly where he was before the invasion. Some say he had been exiled. Others believe he was simply biding his time. But when the Chams attacked, Jayavarman led a furious counter-offensive, rallying troops and reclaiming the capital. And when the dust settled, he declared himself king. Not just king, but the only king capable of saving the soul of the empire. And he meant it. Jayavarman VII wasn't your typical ruler. He didn't begin his reign with a military parade. He began with hospitals. Jayavarman launched the largest construction project in Khmer history. He didn't just repair what was broken, he started again. New roads, new temples, new canals. The empire's face changed, stone by stone, inscription by inscription. But that's just the beginning. That's right, over 100 of them, scattered across the empire. Built not for show, but for care. Each one staffed with doctors, herbalists and monks, each one stocked with medicinal plants and sacred texts. He called them places where no one suffers. And in a world where rulers usually solved problems with spears, this was astonishing. Because Jayavarman wasn't building just to rule, he was building to heal himself and his people. Some scholars think he lost his wife, Queen Jayarajavi, early in his reign. In response, he filled the empire with images of compassion, giant Buddhas, gentle smiles, the soft eyes of mercy carved into towers. And at the heart of it all, his own grief. Then, after her death, he married her sister, who was also a devout Buddhist. And that's when things truly transformed. Jayavarman VII became the first Khmer king to fully embrace Mahayana Buddhism, a version of the faith that centers on compassion and the idea of the bodhisattva, a being who delays enlightenment to help others. Jayavarman didn't just admire this idea, he became it. That's why you'll find his face. Yes, his actual face, carved into dozens of towers. You've seen it, serene, closed eyes, faint smile, sometimes mistaken for Buddha, but scholars agree, it's him, watching, forever. These are the famous towers of Bayon, his central temple. Bayon is the anti-Angkor Wat, where Angkor Wat is strict, symmetrical, almost mathematical. Bayon is chaotic, labyrinthine, full of faces and winding corridors and strange dreamlike carvings. It doesn't impose, it envelops. He also built Tas Prum, a temple famously left crumbling into the jungle. Not because it wasn't sacred, but because it was meant to be embraced by nature. He dedicated it to his mother, calling her a refuge for all beings. The temple walls practically hewn with quiet sadness and quiet love. And those carvings, they're not just gods and myths. They show real life, fishermen, market scenes, women giving birth, kids playing games, No other Khmer temple has scenes like this. It's as if Jayavarman wanted to remember the entire world, not just the heavenly one. But even a king of compassion needed to flex now and then. Jayavarman fought wars. He expanded Khmer territory deeper into Laos and Thailand. His roads helped troops move faster. His temples anchored the borders. And when necessary, his elephants marched. Still, Jayavarman was playing a delicate game. Buddhism might have been rising, but the old Hindu priesthood still held power. Temples dedicated to Shiva and Vishnu weren't erased. They were absorbed, recontextualized. You'll often find Buddhist statues hidden in former Hindu sanctuaries. The transition wasn't always peaceful. Some idols were replaced, some shrines vandalized. Historians still argue whether Jayavarman was trying to unite faiths, or quietly dismantle the old ones. And yet, despite the military victories, it's his gentleness that echoes. One inscription addressed to a sick subject reads, "He suffered as if it were his own illness." That's not typical royal speak. That's something else. Something human. But when he died, the world shifted again. His successors, tied to the old Hindu traditions, rolled much of it back. They restored old gods, reclaimed old temples. In some places they even erased his face from the towers, literally chiseled it off. His reforms were massive. His building projects, unstoppable. But even for a bodhisattva king, time was brutal. Jayavarman ruled for over 30 years, and by the end his temples were everywhere. His face watched every road. His roads connected every soul. Jayavarman VII is still here. That calm, that presence, that flicker of something gentle in the stone. And yet, not all of them vanished. Enough of his image remains that centuries later, when you walk into Bayon at dawn and see those silent faces blinking out of the fog, you feel it. You've seen them in the photos. Those silent stone faces, serene, massive, eyes half closed like they're mid-thought or mid-prayer. They're everywhere at Bayon. 37 towers left standing today, many with 4 faces each, smiling in every direction. You walk through the temple, and no matter where you go, one of them is always watching. He's just listening. At first it feels peaceful, then a little unsettling. That face. Historians still argue about that. It's Jayavarman VII, or Buddha, or both. But one thing is clear, that smile outlasted everything. The power, the wars, even the empire itself. It's the last thing to fade when the sun sets over Angkor. Those eyes, and that tiny knowing smile. And it watched the whole thing fall apart. Jayavarman VII had built a kingdom of compassion, but his reforms were heavy, expensive, and not universally loved. Building temples, hospitals, and roads on that scale drained the treasury. His wars, though successful, stretched the empire to its limits, and the religious shift, from Hinduism to Mahayana Buddhism, left cracks in the spiritual foundation. The priesthoods loyal to Shiva and Vishnu had been sidelined for too long. Jayavarman's successors, especially Jayavarman VIII, swung the pendulum hard in the other direction. Buddhism was pushed out, Hinduism was reinstated as the official religion, and the symbols of the former king's reforms were literally carved away. Those serene faces? After his death, those cracks became fault lines. Some were defaced, others buried. Temples were converted, Buddhist icons replaced with Shiva lingas. It was a spiritual rollback, and a very physical one. Imagine chiseling out your predecessor's legacy, stone by stone. But the damage wasn't just religious, it was political. The empire's outer territories, so carefully bound by Jayavarman's roads and temples, began to fray. Local governors stopped answering letters, tribute dried up, and out in the west, a new power had been growing quietly. The Sukhothai kingdom, in what's now Thailand. By the late 13th century, Siamese forces began pressing eastward. Not in huge invasions at first, just skirmishes, territory grabs, polite nudges. But Angkor wasn't built for defense. It had no great walls, no natural barriers. It wasn't supposed to need them. The king's divinity was supposed to keep everything in place. Now that belief was fraying too. The Siamese had once been Khmer subjects, or at least allies. But now they were organizing, expanding. learning from the empire's blueprints, its architecture, writing, and warfare, and using them against it. And in the background of all this, something quieter was happening, something slower and more permanent. Tree rings and sediment studies show that Southeast Asia experienced a cycle of floods and droughts during the empire's final centuries. Extreme weather events, much like today's, began to strain the intricate water systems that once made Angkor the envy of the world. The baris dried out, the canals clogged, the flow stopped, the climate was shifting. They watched as the taxes slowed, as rebellion simmered, as enemies approached. They watched as people whispered, "Why isn't the king stopping this?" And so the smiles at Bayan watched as the harvests shrank. The Khmer had always relied on precise water management. Too little rain, crops fail; too much, reservoirs overflow, and irrigation breaks. Their brilliance had always walked a tightrope. Now that rope was unraveling. And the answer, terrifyingly, was the empire had grown too wide, too ornate, too complex. And like many great powers before it, it began to rot from the edges inward. He can't. There was no single collapse, no climactic final battle, just a slow exhale. Cities abandoned, roads unused, kings still performing rituals for gods that no longer seemed to answer. Eventually, even the capital itself began to drift. By the 15th century, the seat of power quietly relocated south, closer to the Mekong, to more fertile lands, and farther from the crumbling dream of Angkor. Quirky detail? The temples were never completely abandoned. Local villagers, monks, and pilgrims kept visiting, praying, caring. Some even scratched graffiti into the walls, little notes of love, prayers for mercy, doodles of elephants and fish. A temple might be fallen, but to those living nearby, it was still sacred. Bayan, battered but still standing, became a ghost cathedral. Its towers still looked out over an empire that no longer responded to them. The faces watched as the jungle returned. Roots wrapped the walls. Rain softened the carvings, and still the smiles held. Stone doesn't mourn. It just remembered. That's the eerie beauty of Khmer architecture. It lingers, even after kingdoms fall, even after maps change. And Bayan, with its 1,000-yard stare and eternal calm, remembers everything. If you ever visit at dawn, before the tourists, before the heat, you might stand alone in the central tower, surrounded by those faces. You'll hear nothing but cicadas. The light will shift slowly through the stone corridors. And for a second, you'll wonder, was Jayavarman's vision really lost? Because somewhere deep inside Bayan, the empire is still breathing. Or did he win? Just a little. It's easy to imagine that everyone in the Khmer Empire believed the same thing. That if the king said the gods liked you, then the gods liked you. Simple, ordered, set in stone. Because after Jayavarman VII reshaped the empire in the image of Mahayana Buddhism, gentle, compassionate, focused on mercy, his successors yanked the wheel hard in the opposite direction. And suddenly, the divine got very competitive. But belief is never simple. Not even when it's carved onto temple walls. Especially not in Angkor. This is what happens when faith splits the crown in two. Let's be clear, religion was never just a personal thing in the Khmer world. It was politics, it was identity, and when the king's legitimacy depends on the gods, changing gods mid-reign is like changing the locks on heaven's door. It confuses everyone, especially the priests. Jayavarman VII had made Buddhism central. His temples were filled with serene Buddhas, compassionate bodhisattvas, and imagery of healing. But after his death, Jayavarman VIII flipped the table. He was a devout Shaivite, a worshipper of Shiva, and he wasn't here to share, and not subtly, either. One inscription even boasts about breaking over 30,000 Buddha statues. That's not restoration. That's erasure. Buddhist images were defaced or destroyed. Statues of the Buddha were decapitated. Reliefs were scraped clean. Even Jayavarman VII's own likeness, his iconic peaceful smile, was chiseled off many towers. Some temples were forcibly reconsecrated to Hindu gods. One moment you were a sanctuary of compassion, the next a shrine to cosmic destruction. His reign began with a purge. Why the hostility? Historians still debate it. Was Jayavarman X trying to appease the conservative priesthood, appeal to old power structures? Or did he genuinely believe that the empire's struggles, droughts, war, rebellion were punishment for abandoning the Hindu gods? Whatever the reason, this religious about-face destabilized the empire further. It divided temples, it divided officials, and it confused the heck out of ordinary people. Imagine being a farmer whose family had prayed to a serene Buddha for 30 years, only to be told, actually, never mind, it's Shiva now, here's a linga, hope your rice still grows. Temples themselves became spiritual battlegrounds. You'll find reliefs that were partially defaced, Buddha figures hacked away while other carvings were left untouched. Some temples show clear signs of multiple conversions, like spiritual palimpsests layered over each other. In one case, a shrine to a bodhisattva was literally bricked shut, then a new entrance carved to redirect visitors to a different idol. But while kings waged holy edits in the capital, out in the provinces, people probably kept doing what they always did. A bit of Buddhism, a bit of Hinduism, maybe some ancestor worship, maybe a rice spirit, or two just to be safe. Khmer religion was always more fluid than the inscriptions would have you believe. It's one thing to fight a war, it's another to fight over what gods should even exist. Still, at the royal level, this back and forth drained power. Every new king had to rebuild legitimacy, not just politically, but cosmically. That meant new temples, new shrines, new symbols, each one more expensive than the last. And the empire was running out of coin and patience. Meanwhile, outside the borders, the Siamese and Vietnamese kingdoms were growing bolder, watching, learning. And inside, internal divisions were calcifying. The royal court was a maze of factions, some Hindu, some Buddhist, some simply loyal to whoever paid their salary on time. Even royal funerals became sites of theological debate, cremation or burial, which mantras to chant, which gods to invoke. Every ritual became a statement, not just about the dead, but about what kind of empire should follow, trying to keep it spiritually consistent across centuries. Almost impossible. It's exhausting, isn't it? Building an empire is hard enough. And all this, the shifting faith, the growing tension, the mixed signals, added to the deepening cracks in the empire. Political loyalty became fragile, military unity became uncertain, and the people, caught between gods and kings, just wanted their rice fields to flood properly, and their ancestors to stop haunting the granary. Quirky side note, some temples from this period began including both Hindu and Buddhist iconography in the same building. One doorway would lead to a shrine of Vishnu, while another housed a Buddha. It wasn't harmony, it was confusion made of stone. As if the architects were hedging their bets. Whoever wins, we're covered. In the end, the spiritual tug-of-war didn't tear Angkor down by itself, but it weakened the walls, blurred the vision, unraveled the thread of belief that had once sewn the kingdom together like a sacred robe. Because when the king no longer agrees with the temple, and the temple no longer agrees with itself, the gods stop listening, and the jungle begins to move in. It's elephants. It starts quietly. A rustle in the leaves, a shimmer of movement on the far edge of the forest, maybe a glint of polished bronze. A sound, low, distant, rhythmic, like a drum beat. Except it's not drums. And they're not yours. For centuries, the Khmer Empire had been the big player in the region. They built the biggest temples, controlled the most land, commanded armies, and managed water like they were born part river. But now, the jungle itself was closing in. Not with vines this time, but with rivals. These weren't your standard enemy troops. They didn't march in columns, or fight in neat, straight lines. They moved through trees, ambushed convoys, and came with war elephants, massive, armored, trained animals that could carry 2 or 3 warriors each, including archers, or even spear throwers on their backs. And when an elephant charged, you didn't stand your ground. You see, the Khmer weren't alone in Southeast Asia, and for a long time, their neighbors, especially the Siamese, who would later be called the Thai, had watched from the wings. They admired the temples, they copied the art, they learned the language, and then slowly, they began to push back. Khmer armies had elephants too, of course. But battles between them were never just about who had more tusks. They were about speed, morale, cleverness, ambushes, river crossings, the right terrain at the right time. The Khmer, with their big cities and open layouts, began to feel the pressure. Roads that once carried monks and traders now had to move troops. Temples once meant for pilgrims became supply caches, or lookout points. And while many of these conflicts weren't full-scale wars, they were skirmishes, tests. They started to wear the empire thin. You ran. Meanwhile, the Siamese weren't just gaining strength. They were developing their own style, not just politically, but culturally. They adapted Khmer aesthetics, but mixed them with new beliefs, different rituals, a fresh energy, and their capital city, Ayutthaya, started rising like a rival sun. And here's the bitter irony. The Khmer had taught them everything: architecture, language, court ceremony, even the Sanskrit titles for their kings. It's like training your apprentice only to have them invent a newer, shinier version of everything you ever built, and then come back with elephants to test it out. Worse still, the empire had stretched itself thin. All those temples and highways and reservoirs, they needed maintenance, skilled labor, money, and with the outer provinces growing restless, and climate shifts making harvests unpredictable, things started falling through the cracks. Literally, canals silted up, berets dried out, and armies had to spend as much time fighting local rebellions as foreign raids. Even the inscriptions change. Early Khmer temples were full of confidence. The king built this, the gods are pleased, all is in balance. But now, the language grows anxious. May the gods protect us. We offer this so that disaster may not strike. One inscription is basically a royal "please don't let the crops fail again" letter carved in stone. This wasn't just happening in the west. From the east, the Qingmen was still a threat, and to the north, Lanzang, in present-day Laos, was rising too. The Khmer, once the center of a great wheel, were now feeling pressure from every spoke. And the kings? They were changing too. Quirky note: there's one carving probably from the 14th century showing a Khmer general getting kicked by an elephant. It's weirdly detailed, his helmet's flying off, his spear's broken. Was it a warning? A joke? A political cartoon? We'll never know, but it says something when even the carvings start turning against the empire. Back in Angkor, things were getting quiet. Not all at once, not like a candle going out, more like a long, slow exhale. The roads still existed, but fewer messengers traveled them. The temples still stood, but fewer pilgrims arrived. Ceremonies happened, but with less pomp, less gold, fewer dancers. Gone were the bold god-kings of old who could command the heavens with a gesture. These new rulers seemed tentative, weary, less divine, more human. They still built temples, still offered prayers, but it felt more like habit than conviction, like keeping the ritual going because it's all you have left. The jungle noticed. It started creeping back in. Quietly, roots snuck between stones, vines curled around towers, walls cracked, then crumbled. Roofs collapsed during the rainy season and were never fixed. A fig tree took root in a sacred stairwell. No one cleared it. Eventually, people just started using another entrance. This time from Ayutthaya, the rising Siamese kingdom. A major invasion around the 15th century. They pushed hard. Hard enough that the Khmer abandoned Angkor, not destroyed, not burned, but left behind. The capital shifted south, toward more defensible land. Angkor remained, but as a shadow, a memory, a city of ghosts and prayers. And the elephants came again. Bayan's smiles were still there, but now they stared over empty fields. The empire had moved on. Still, it's easy to romanticize this fall, to imagine it all crumbling in a single thunderstorm, dramatic and final. But real endings are rarely that clean. They're slow, confusing, like waking up and realizing you don't quite live in the center of the world anymore. Temples that once held royal ashes became jungle real estate. Pilgrims still came. Monks still prayed. But the empire, and even as enemies danced through your sacred forests, and elephants trampled your roads, and the jungle swallowed your towers, it just watched. The stone didn't flinch. The Khmer Empire was built on water, controlled it, worshipped it, designed entire cities around it. But when the rain gods started acting up, not even the most sacred reservoir could save them. First, let's go back to those bares, those massive reservoirs, the pride of Khmer engineering. At its peak, Angkor had a water grid that was almost mythical in scale. Canals, moats, bridges, dams. It didn't just irrigate, it symbolized divine order. If the king was in harmony with the heavens, the water would flow. Simple as that. This is the story of too much water, then not enough, and how the very system that made Angkor thrive may have quietly drowned it from within. Tree rings, lake sediments, and even mud samples. Yes, people study mud, tell us that Southeast Asia was hit by severe climate swings, massive floods, followed by punishing droughts. Monsoons became chaotic, rain came too hard, too fast, then disappeared completely. The Khmer system wasn't built for that. But starting in the 14th century, something changed. They built more canals, adjusted slopes, repaired spillways. But each patch job made the system more complicated, more fragile, like adding duct tape to a dam. One inscription from this era even mentions workers being mobilized to dig emergency ditches. Imagine, you're a rice farmer already dealing with famine, and now you're being pulled into a desperate engineering project to stop the divine plumbing from bursting. And here's the nightmare: the empire tried to fix it. It was too rigid, too tuned to a specific pattern of seasons. When the rain came late, the bares sat empty. When it came in violent bursts, they overflowed, carving gullies through sacred fields and washing away dikes that had stood for centuries. Angkor, once a masterpiece of slow, elegant water management, had become overbuilt and overwhelmed. Meanwhile, the city kept expanding. People were still building, still performing ceremonies, still pretending the universe was stable, but the canals told a different story. One site, the West Bure, is especially telling. It's absolutely massive, still visible from space, and for a time it seemed like the answer to everything. But sediment layers suggest it's silted up, choked with mud and debris, unable to hold what it once could, like a giant lung that suddenly forgot how to breathe. You can almost picture him at a royal ceremony performing the rain invocation, standing in sacred robes before a crowd of worried nobles, while dark clouds rumble behind him, ready to tear the sky open or vanish without a drop. Water levels dropped, fields turned to dust, and then, when the rain returned, it came too hard, cracking levees, flooding homes, washing away faith. Literally, temples flooded, crops failed, and all the while, the king's spiritual responsibility, his duty to maintain cosmic harmony, slipped through his fingers like wet sand. Historians still argue whether climate change was the reason Angkor fell, but few doubt it was a reason. Not the dramatic elephant charging through the gates kind of reason, but a slow, invisible unraveling. Was the king cursed? Had the gods turned away? Or had the system simply reached its limit? Because when your water doesn't work, nothing works. Remember, the Khmer weren't just measuring time with days and months, they were tracking divine cycles. Water was part of the cosmic clock. When that clock broke, so did the empire's sense of order. And here's something haunting. The Khmer never really talked about this collapse. There's no dramatic final inscription, no temple wall that says we lost everything because the rain betrayed us. The records just stop. Like someone mid-sentence who suddenly forgets what they were saying. You can't feed your people. You can't sustain your roads. You can't trade or worship or hold festivals. And worst of all, you lose control of the calendar. Instead, what we see is adaptation. The capital slowly shifts south, toward the Tonle Sap Lake, where fishing replaced farming. Smaller temples appear. The stone gets plainer, the gods more local. The grandeur of Angkor gives way to modest practicality. No more pretending the king is the axis of the cosmos. Now he's just a ruler of rivers and fish. And the jungle, patient as always, starts its quiet reclamation. Vines creep into the cracks of the overbuilt canals. Tree roots burrow into unused spillways. Temples once reflected in shimmering berets now sit beside mudflats and weeds. And in some places, lotus flowers bloom where armies once bathed before battle. Quirky note: lotus grows best in shallow, still water, exactly the kind that accumulates in abandoned reservoirs. So yes, even the empire's decay became accidentally beautiful. There's something deeply poetic about it. The Khmer Empire rose by mastering water, that serene smile on Bayan. It watched the canals dry up, it watched the floods come. It heard the panic, the whispered prayers, the splashing of emergency ditch diggers in the dark. And it may have faded by trying too hard to keep mastering it, even when the skies had other plans. And it smiled, anyway. Close your eyes for a second and imagine Angkor at its peak. You're not in a stone temple this time. You're walking through a neighborhood. Wooden houses on stilts rise around you. Children run barefoot on packed earth paths. Smoke curls from clay stoves. Chickens dart under laundry lines. It smells like rice porridge and river mud. You hear music, not temple gongs, but flutes, laughter, someone telling a story, loud enough to make the neighbors sigh. It's alive, and it's all gone. That's the problem with wooden cities. We forget this sometimes. We walk among the temples and imagine quiet, holy places. But in reality, Angkor was noisy, sweaty, crowded, full of people and smells, and heat, and mess. A city of perhaps 1 million souls at its height, that would have made it one of the largest cities in the world at the time, on par with medieval London or Beijing. They vanish. Everything we see today, Angkor Wat, Bayan, Taprom, is the stone skeleton, the divine parts, the monuments to gods and kings. But 90% of Angkor, it was wood, and the jungle doesn't care how sacred your city is. If it's made of timber, it rots, collapses, disappears without a trace. But when you rely on wood, bamboo, thatch materials designed to breathe with the tropics, you don't leave fossils, you leave whispers. Turns out, the temples were just the tip of the city. Archaeologists have had to get clever. They fly planes over the area using LiDAR, a kind of laser mapping system that can see through the tree canopy, and what they've found is astonishing. Hidden grids, foundation mounds, roads and ponds, and entire neighborhoods we never knew existed. They've basically redrawn the map of Angkor using invisible architecture. One curious detail that's come up in these findings: roads that didn't lead to temples. They led to houses, big ones, maybe noble families, priesthoods, or senior officials. This means the Khmer elite had their own domestic architecture, private compounds, maybe even gardens. None of it survived, but the soil remembers. The rest, markets, homes, workshops, rice storage sheds, dance schools, tattoo huts, fishing docks, whole villages built around each sacred hub, humming with life. And all of it organic, flexible, human, and deeply, tragically impermanent. So what happened to all of that? We're talking subtle things: discoloration in the ground, the shape of old post holes, even residue from hearths. These are the faint echoes of lives lived outside the sacred gaze of the temple. When the empire began to decline, slowly, painfully, like a tree dying branch by branch, the wooden city didn't leave behind monuments, it left behind absence. When the royal court moved south, so did the officials, the traders, the laborers. The suburbs drained out, and what didn't move fell apart. There's a metaphor in there somewhere. The jungle helped. Termites, rain, mold, heat. Bamboo turns to mulch in months if no one maintains it. Thatched roofs collapse under a single season of monsoon. Raised walkways rot and fall into the mud. Without humans, wooden cities don't age. They disappear. We have no idea what a typical Khmer breakfast looked like. We don't know what lullabies they sang, what jokes they told, what gossip filled the air when festivals ended. We don't know the names of most of the people who lived there, only the kings, and the gods, and the scribes who carved stone. And here's the real tragedy: so much of everyday life is gone. Meanwhile, the stone temples, the dead parts of the city stayed. The homes vanished, the gods endured. It gives Angkor a weird, haunting afterimage. A city full of temples, but no people. Like finding a ghost town built entirely out of cathedrals. And most of it faded without a sound. Even the language shifted. Ancient Khmer evolved, and many of the old words for food, furniture, or family habits simply vanished. When we try to reconstruct these lives, We're left guessing, piecing together fragments, like holding a spoon and trying to imagine the soup. Historians still debate how much of Angkor was urbanized. Was it a true metropolis or a sacred sprawl of ceremonial zones and rice farming villages? The truth, like most things, is probably in between. But one thing is certain, it was a living city. Messy, human, complicated. And yet, somehow, they feel louder than stone. Every once in a while, something slips through, a wooden beam preserved by mud, a broken comb, a child's footprint fossilized in clay near a temple's outer wall. Little things, quiet things, because they remind us that this empire wasn't just a story of kings and gods, it was a story of people, thousands of them, carving fish, raising kids, cooking dinner, sweating under the same sun we still know. And the only reason we forget is because their homes didn't survive the rain. People like us. By now, the outer edges of the empire were already pulling away, tugged by rival kings, rebellious provinces, and the slow disintegration of roads and reservoirs. But something even more unsettling was happening at the core. The divine city, Angkor, once a beacon of sacred geometry and royal certainty, was becoming hollow. Not in ruins yet, but drifting. You could still see monks at sunrise, hear prayers echoing off sandstone, smell incense curling through the temple corridors. But something vital had gone quiet. The center couldn't hold. Kings were still being crowned, temples still built, but the authority behind it all felt weaker, like a radio playing static where a god's voice used to be. But now, here's the thing, an empire isn't just about power, it's about meaning. The Khmer world had been built on cosmic alignment, the idea that the king sat at the center of the universe, the berets mirrored the ocean of milk, the towers pointed to Mount Meru, and the temples channeled divine energy. Every bit of it wove together into a massive symbolic order, a mandala, in stone. The roads were cracking, the canals misaligned. New kings didn't bother finishing old temples. Some inscriptions skipped the usual flattery altogether. No, he who is the axis of the world, just basic logistics. One temple from this era doesn't even list the king's name. It's like they were going through the motions. But the faith in the system was thinning. And Angkor wasn't safe. After the 4031 Siamese invasion, whether it was a full-on conquest or just a heavy raid is still debated. The capital was more vulnerable than ever. The royal family moved south, toward the Mekong, to Phnom Penh. That much we know, but what's remarkable is how quietly it happened. No final battle, no ceremonial farewell. Just absent, what was once the center of the Khmer world became a ghost. The palaces, built from wood, rotted and fell. The temples, sacred but inconvenient, were left behind. Local monks kept praying, farmers kept farming, but the pulse of power had moved. Imagine living through that. You're a potter, a temple dancer, a scribe, and one day, the officials stop showing up. No more tax collectors, no more royal processions, just silence. The beret isn't cleaned this season. The reservoir doesn't fill. Your cousin moves south. Your neighbor disappears, one by one. The threads unravel. Some people left. Others adapted. They turned temple courtyards into village squares. They stored grain in shrines. Monks took over roles once held by royal bureaucrats. Life went on, but the empire didn't. But not all the unraveling was external. Inside the court, inside the temples, internal decay did its part too, with no central king strong enough to unite faith and politics. Smaller kingdoms began to rise. Regional lords grew bold. Some inscriptions speak of great men building temples, not kings. That's a quiet revolution, hidden in polite stone. The jungle didn't come crashing in overnight. It came the way moss grows, on a sleeping statue, slow, patient, gentle. It had started as a Hindu temple dedicated to Vishnu, no less. But by the 16th century it was repurposed into a Theravada Buddhist sanctuary, a new faith, a new rhythm. It wasn't destroyed, it was adapted, like an old song played in a new key. Even Angkor Wat, the crown jewel, changed hands. Quirky detail. During this period, Pilgrims carved their names into the walls. We know because many of them wrote in modern Khmer script. Some of them left dates, prayers, even doodles. In a temple once built to echo cosmic truth, you now have someone scratching, "I was here, year of the tiger." It's easy to romanticize the fall of empires as tragedy. And yes, there's sadness here, but there's also resilience. Angkor didn't explode, it evolved. It wasn't burned, it was outgrown. But sometimes, it's the fading that tells the deeper truth. And maybe that's harder to see, harder to memorialize. We like grand collapses, not slow fade-outs. People quietly move on, not out of hate, but out of need. Because when an empire no longer serves the people, when its temples no longer align with the sky, when its water no longer flows, and its gods no longer feel close, the rituals fade. The great reservoirs become lotus ponds, the roads empty, still, and the center, once pulsing with meaning, becomes. If the Khmer Empire was a dream cast in stone, then Angkor Wat was its clearest vision. Perfect, symmetrical, stubbornly eternal. It was Hindu, and yet, it wasn't built for Buddhism. Built in the early 12th century by Suryavarman II, Angkor Wat wasn't just a temple, it was a cosmic machine. 5 towers to mirror the 5 peaks of Mount Meru, moats as vast as rivers to represent the celestial ocean, galleries filled with divine battles, heavenly dancers, and enough sacred math to make a modern engineer sweat. But here's what's astonishing. The layout is a marvel. The entire structure is aligned to the spring equinox. The towers mimic the planets. The bas-reliefs run counterclockwise, the reverse of standard temple practice. Because Vishnu was seen as a god of the West, every stone was a line in a sacred poem, and Angkor Wat was the chant made solid. Specifically, it was a Vishnu temple, which was unusual. Most earlier Khmer temples focused on Shiva, the god of destruction and rebirth. But Suryavarman was devoted to Vishnu, the preserver, and he made sure the temple didn't just honor Vishnu, it embodied him. While palaces rotted and roads vanished into jungle, Angkor Wat stayed. It was too big, too sacred, too perfectly constructed to be forgotten. Instead of being abandoned, it was adopted. Angkor Wat did not. After the empire fell, that's rare in history. By the 16th century, Buddhist monks had moved in. They swept the galleries, lit incense, tended to small statues in corners where royal feet once walked. And so a Hindu temple built by a god king became a Theravada Buddhist monastery, quietly, gracefully, without war or fire. Temples are usually destroyed or defiled when empires change hands. But Angkor Wat simply shifted. A new faith flowed through its old halls like rain through an ancient canal. Even more incredible, the architecture held up, and while the rest of Angkor crumbled, Angkor Wat remained the one place where prayers never stopped. Stone-on-stone construction, with no mortar. Foundations laid to flex with seasonal floodwaters, carvings so deep they still cast shadows at dusk. Suryavarman's builders knew exactly what they were doing, and they built it to last forever. And the people knew it too. Villagers nearby never stopped visiting. Some even believed the temple was built by divine beings, giants, or Naga spirits, or god kings from a golden age. When French explorers discovered it in the 19th century, they were amazed to find monks already living inside. Surprise, it had never been lost. What they did do was try to restore it. Recarve stones, clear vines, document every inch. But they also brought with them a kind of romantic myth, the idea of a lost city in the jungle, a ruined kingdom swallowed by time. In truth, Angkor Wat was never lost. It had just become local again. Quirky detail. French visitors were baffled by the steep staircases. Some believed they were poorly designed. In fact, they were built to be deliberately difficult. You weren't meant to walk up casually. You were meant to ascend, to sweat and tremble as you approached the divine. No cranes. No cement. Just vision, manpower, and belief. And when you reach the top, on a clear morning, the view is humbling. The towers rise like lotus buds. The moat glimmers. The forest breathes on all sides. The symmetry is so perfect, it almost unnerves you. It was, and is, a mirror. Angkor Wat outlasted its kings, its faith, even its language. Today, it's on the Cambodian flag, the only national flag in the world that features a temple, because this wasn't just a ruin of the empire, of the idea that something sacred can outlive even the gods who built it, and maybe that's why it stayed intact, of the people. Because somewhere, through all the dynasties and droughts and invasions, someone kept believing it still mattered. Someone kept lighting incense. Someone kept walking the causeway. Even when the empire around it forgot how, the empire was gone, but the stones stayed. Someone kept whispering prayers, a playground for pilgrims, a target for looters, and a canvas for holy mischief. And when something sacred survives in silence, it begins to collect stories, some whispered in prayer, some carved with knives. Because long after the kings vanished and the court dances stopped, the temples of Angkor became something else entirely. Let's start with the pilgrims. After the fall of Angkor as a political capital, the temples didn't just sit there growing moss. People still came, locals, wandering monks, traders passing through, farmers on festival days. Theravada Buddhism had taken hold by then, and the older temples once packed with Hindu symbolism were gently reinterpreted. A sanctuary for Vishnu, a peaceful meditation hall. A tower meant for Shiva, now it's housing a Buddha. And on the walls, graffiti. Some temples, like Angkor Wat, became full-blown monasteries. Monks lived in side galleries, grew herbs in the courtyards, rang bells from half-collapsed towers. They left behind their own layer of history, painted murals, palm leaf manuscripts, tiny statues tucked into old niches like notes left for the gods. No destruction, just repurposing, spiritual recycling. Some reverent, some not so much. In the 1600s, a Japanese traveler named Yukondayu came to Angkor as a pilgrim. And what did he do when he got there? He carved his name into the stone, along with the date and a short poem. He wasn't the only one. Several Japanese inscriptions survive, little reminders that the temples had become part of a global sacred landscape. Angkor was no longer just Khmer. It was holy to everyone who wandered through. But not everyone came with flowers and good intentions. By the 18th and 19th centuries, looters arrived. Even Angkor Wat lost pieces. Statues, wall panels, and priceless relics disappeared without a trace. In some temples you can still see the square holes where precious stones were once set. Gone now, pried loose centuries ago. Some were colonial agents, collecting artifacts for museums in Paris or London. Others were treasure hunters. The temples, by now mostly unguarded, were easy targets. Delicate carvings were hacked out with chisels. Sculptures sawn off at the base and carted away. Whole Buddha heads vanished into private collections. Some left prayers. One visitor carved a wish for a child. Another etched the Khmer equivalent of "May my sons be safe." Some scratched tiny fish into the corners, symbols of good fortune. A few got bolder. Whole poems etched in looping letters, love notes to gods or lovers. It wasn't vandalism, it was belief. Just very personal. Because not everyone who carved into the walls did it to steal. And yet, amidst all that loss, there was a weird kind of joy. Others got mischievous. In a few temples, archaeologists have found carvings of tiny animals in strange places. A monkey juggling lotus flowers. An elephant that looks suspiciously like it's laughing. One temple even has a doodle of what might be a crocodile wearing a crown. Nobody really knows why. Was it a joke? A dare? A bored monk carving with a stick on a slow day? Historians still argue whether these little carvings were sacred or satirical. But one thing's clear. Angkor wasn't frozen in reverence. It was lived in, reinterpreted, made weird in the best ways. Because temples aren't museums. They're only sacred if someone treats them that way. Whether it's a monk lighting incense, a farmer praying for rain, or a traveler scrawling their name next to a 1,000-year-old god, they all added to the story. And that's what kept it alive. Even the French, when they rediscovered Angkor in the 1860s, were stunned not by ruins, but by activity. They expected silence. Instead, they found monks chanting, chickens pecking around Buddha statues, and local people living in and around the ancient halls like it was the most normal thing in the world. quirky detail. Some colonial archaeologists were annoyed by this. They wanted to restore the temples to their original glory, which often meant removing anything modern, including monks. The local people, to their credit, mostly ignored that. Ancient sandstone at the base, and so, angkor became layered. Graffiti prayers squeezed between all three, French scaffolding around the edges. Medieval Buddhist prayer flags, fluttering above. It wasn't decay, it was a palimpsest, a sacred site, rewritten over and over, with reverence and rebellion in equal measure. Today, when you visit, you'll still see traces of it. You might step over a faded carving made by a royal scribe in the 1100s, then walk past a 17th century Japanese prayer, then find a monk sweeping the courtyard in orange robes while tourists whisper behind phone cameras. The looters, the lovers, the prayers, the jokes, the serious and the silly stitched together into one long act of devotion. It's all still there. Sacred places don't just end, they get filled, because while kings may rise and fall, if you want to understand the Khmer Empire, not just its kings and gods, but its heartbeat, don't start with ruins. Start with stone. Not the big towers or carved gods, though those are impressive. I'm talking about something smaller, quieter, more intimate. Inscriptions. The first thing you notice is that they're precise. Khmer scribes didn't just write, they carved using chisels and careful strokes, often in Sanskrit or Old Khmer. No typos allowed. Every letter had to be perfect, balanced, sacred. These weren't diary entries, they were spells, proclamations, records meant to last for eternity, and they did. Lines of script etched into door frames, lintels, columns, hidden corners, some no bigger than your thumb, others stretching down entire temple galleries. These were the voices of the Khmer, and if you listen closely, they'll tell you everything. Or, thousands survive, some barely legible, others still crisp, like they were carved last week. They tell stories of kings, queens, generals, priests, dancers, merchants. Some are glorious, others are surprisingly mundane, like, this land belongs to the temple. It must not be taxed. 2 jars of clarified butter were delivered monthly. One was sometimes sour. Take the inscriptions at Preah Khan, Jayavarman VII's temple. They list over 430 villages that contributed to its upkeep, everything from rice to incense, to oil, to dancers. You start to see how massive and interconnected the empire was, not just spiritually, but logistically. That's not myth. That's life. Because here's the secret. Many of them were propaganda, and every stone inscription was part inventory, part prayer, part PR campaign. These weren't just temples, they were systems. But that's the Khmer way. The divine and the practical were always woven together. They begin with poetry, epic introductions like, "He who rules with the strength of Indra, who pierces the darkness like the rising sun," and then suddenly shift to taxes and boundary lines. It's as if your local mayor opened a city ordinance with a Shakespearean sonnet before getting to zoning laws. And yet some inscriptions are heartbreaking. One from a woman named Kuvati simply reads, "No kings, no temples, just a wish that time wouldn't erase her." She offered this stone as a sign of her devotion. May her family be remembered. One inscription warns that anyone stealing temple land will be reborn as a louse under a beggar's foot. Another contains a recipe for medicine, supposedly blessed by the gods, though it mostly sounds like crushed roots and wishful thinking. And one temple has graffiti that might be the Khmer version of "Knock was here," dated to the 1600s, complete with a little smiley face. Others come from soldiers, or temple cooks, or orphaned children placed under a temple's protection. You can feel the hopes embedded in the stone. "Don't forget me. Let this offering last. Let my soul find peace." And the weird ones. Oh, they're glorious. Historians debate how many of these inscriptions were truly read by the public. Many were placed in out-of-the-way spots, corners of shrines, obscure corridors. Were they meant for human eyes, or divine ones? It's possible they were offerings in themselves. Just as temples fed monks, the act of writing in stone fed the soul. If your name was on the wall, you'd live forever. Or at least, you might, and some names did endure. Quirky side note, Some stones contain errors, a missing character, a misaligned line, and in those cases, the whole thing was often abandoned, flipped over, or repurposed as a foundation block. Even mistakes had consequences when you were writing for the gods, and that makes it all the more remarkable when you run your fingers gently across those letters today. We know about queens because of inscriptions, poets, dancers, even animals. Yes, some temples list the sacred elephants and horses that served the king. His Majesty's elephant, Silver Thunder, carried him to war and was beloved by all. You don't carve that unless you care.
They're still there.
The king's voice, the monk's prayer, the scribe's long aching arm, steadying the chisel while the sun beat down. It's all still there, even after rain, heat, war, looting, jungle, waiting for someone to read them again. Not frozen, not silent, just waiting. Picture a road, not a slick highway or a neon-lit boulevard, but a long dusty path, sun-baked and humming with cicadas, lined with sugar palms, traveled by ox carts, barefoot monks, soldiers on elephants, and merchants hauling woven baskets full of tamarind, salt, and sandalwood. These were the Khmer roads, the empire's lifelines. They didn't get carved in stone like temples. They didn't get worshipped, but without them nothing worked. No empire, no temples, no trade, no crown. The roads were the nervous system of the Khmer world, quietly holding everything together. And here's the thing, these roads were brilliantly made. These roads stretched across Cambodia, into modern-day Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam. Some connected temples. Others led to ports, where goods could be shipped across the region. And they weren't random, they were carefully aligned, part of a bigger cosmic plan, where movement itself was sacred. It's like the empire had a built-in highway hospitality service, centuries before gas stations and vending machines. Wide, elevated in flood zones, flanked by rest houses, think roadside inns for travelers and pilgrims. One inscription credits Jayavarman VII with building 21 of these, one every 15 to 20 kilometers, complete with wells, shade and space for offerings. But it wasn't just about movement, it was about power. If you could build a road to a region, you could control it. Soldiers could reach rebellions faster, taxes could be collected more efficiently, pilgrims could be monitored, and maybe most importantly, kings could be seen, because Khmer rulers weren't just faces on a coin, they were travelers. Part of their job was to move, to visit temples, make offerings, appear at festivals. These royal processions were loud, dusty, glorious affairs. Drums, dancers, courtiers, guards, elephants decked in silk. It was less road trip, more mobile deity tour. One inscription brags that the king took the road as the gods take the sky. Modest, right? And here's where it gets weird, but there's a deeper logic here. Movement is divinity. If the roads broke, the cosmic cycle broke too. When archaeologists studied the soil and old maps, they realized that many temples were laid out like nodes in a network, not just spiritual hubs, but strategic ones, placed at intervals along the road system. You could almost see it like an early version of a circuit board, the divine energy of the king flowing through roads instead of wires. And of course, roads weren't just for the king. One temple, Tam Yun Tong, was built on a mountain pass near the Thai border. Far from Angkor, yes, but sitting on a major trade artery. Its walls are carved with myth and magic, but the reason it really mattered, it sat on a choke point. Control the road, control the region. The River of Buddhism, for example, traveled along Khmer roads, coming in from Sri Lanka and down through the Thai kingdoms. Priests moved along these dusty veins, sharing prayers, stories, relics. The Khmer Empire didn't just spread politics, it absorbed faith. They carried ideas, quirky detail. Some roads were so well built that you can still see them today in the jungle, beneath the undergrowth, like faint scars in the earth. One aerial study showed a straight Khmer road stretching more than 100 kilometers, laser straight, cutting across rivers, hills, and time. But nothing lasts forever, and the royal presence, the heartbeat of the empire, became less visible. When the empire began to decline, the roads began to break. Not all at once, just slowly, a washed-out bridge here, a crumbling rest house there. Then fewer patrols, fewer offerings, fewer travelers. Trade slowed. Rebellions were harder to reach. Festivals were missed. Ceremonies shortened. Historians still argue whether the roads failed because the empire weakened, or if the empire weakened because the roads failed, likely both. Like veins collapsing around a tired heart. One thing is certain, when the Khmer roads stopped humming, the center faded. Yet, even now, walk through the Cambodian countryside, and you'll sometimes stumble onto a strangely straight path, cutting through fields where the GPS gets confused. Ask an elder, and they might shrug and say, "That's the old road." There, a new capital began to rise. When the heart of Angkor stopped beating, the empire didn't die outright. It shifted, like a great river that, instead of drying up, simply changed course. And that new course, it flowed south, toward a bend in the river, where the Tonle Sap meets the mighty Mekong, the one that led to the gods, Phnom Penh. And here's why it mattered. It wasn't grand, not at first. Just a riverside settlement, smaller, humbler, closer to the rhythm of trade than the pulse of the gods. But over time, Phnom Penh became the new Khmer face, not built from stone and symmetry, but from wood, water, and adaptation. Unlike Angkor, which looked inward, designed to mirror the cosmos, to impress the gods, Phnom Penh looked outward, toward ships, markets, diplomacy. Instead of being the axis of the universe, it became a port, a meeting place, practical, responsive, alive. Even royal ceremonies became simpler. The king was still sacred, yes, but less divine, more human. He no longer needed massive pyramids to reach the heavens. A clean robe and a lotus flower would do. The Theravada Buddhism was now dominant. No more temple mountains to house god-kings. No more oceanic moats, meant to dazzle Vishnu. The monks here lived in wooden wats, preached humility, emphasized compassion over conquest. Phnom Penh was perfect for that. Its rivers gave access to inland trade and coastal exchanges. Its location made it a pivot point between India, China, and the new colonial world. Rice, spices, textiles, even elephants, all flowed through its markets. The Khmer world had to survive in a new reality, one where rival kingdoms pressed in from every side. The Siamese to the west, the Vietnamese to the east, and now European ships hovering along the coasts, eyes sharp for opportunity. You couldn't survive on old glories anymore, you had to adapt fast. This shift wasn't just spiritual, it was economic. Quirky fact, the name Phnom Penh comes from a legend. A wealthy widow named Phnom Penh found sacred statues inside a floating tree on the river. She built a small shrine on a nearby hill. Phnom means hill in Khmer, and thus the city's spiritual heart was born, not from kings or gods, but from a humble, sharp-eyed grandma with a good sense of timing. Over time, Phnom Penh's wooden skyline grew taller, palaces appeared, monasteries multiplied, and though it never quite matched Angkor's grandeur, it didn't need to. It had something else: survivability.